Do you believe that a mist can carry something besides the wind? On the darkest night of my life, I discovered what lurks on the A837, and I've never been the same since. Before you listen to my story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Maybe you'll help to drive away what follows me around to this day. I've always had an obsession with isolated landscapes. It was as if something about them pulled me in, calling me to solitude and tranquility. And so, one March evening I found myself driving along the A837, that narrow, winding road that cuts through the north of Scotland towards Assynt. The air was damp, and the evening light had dissolved into a darkness that seemed even denser because of the cloud-laden sky. The plan was simple. Arrive at a small guest house I had booked and spend the next few days exploring the beauty of the region. Or at least that's what I had in mind before I heard the first warning. "Avoid driving there at night," said the woman in the shop in Ullapool, where I had stopped to buy snacks. "Strange things happen on those roads." I laughed, thinking it was just a local story to scare unsuspecting tourists. Typical regional folklore. However, when the second person mentioned the same thing, an elderly man filling up his van at the petrol station, my curiosity was piqued. "Lost souls wander in that mist, boy. Be careful," he said, as if it were a final warning. I decided to ignore it. After all, they were just superstitions, and the sky, although threatening, was still clear as I entered the A837. The tarmac seemed to glisten under my car's headlight, reflecting the moisture accumulated by the morning mist. The road was deserted, except for the occasional sound of animals moving in the trees nearby. As time passed, the tranquility began to turn into something more unsettling. Perhaps it was the silence, or maybe it was the shadows of the trees that seemed to stretch across the road like hands reaching for me. I remember looking at the clock on the dashboard. It was already past 10 p.m. The hostel wasn't far away, but the feeling that something was watching me began to weigh on me. That's when I saw the first sign of fog. It came out of nowhere, a low, faint layer that moved slowly across the road, like a live animal sneaking through the shadows. There was something strange about it, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't like the ordinary mists I'd encountered on previous journeys. This one seemed dense, as if it had weight, a presence. The radio, which until then had been playing a folk music station, began to fail. Squeaks appeared, followed by a brief pause. Then the music was replaced by a silence so profound that for a moment I thought the radio had switched off completely. I drove on, trying to dispel the gloomy thoughts. But the more I drove, the more the fog seemed to close in around me, blocking my view of both sides of the road. My headlights were practically useless, illuminating only a few meters ahead before being swallowed up by the opaque white. The tranquility of the landscape that I had so longed for now seemed like a mistake. There was no way back. The GPS showed the hostel just a few minutes away, but something told me that it wasn't going to be a simple route. For a moment, I considered stopping the car. The thought of facing that dense fog on foot seemed less daunting than continuing to drive in almost total blindness. However, the thought of being alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by that almost supernatural haze, kept me firmly behind the wheel. My breathing was heavy. Every heartbeat echoed in my ears like a drum at a funeral. The shadows distorted around the edges of the lighthouse, taking on shapes I couldn't explain. They looked like shadows, but disappeared as soon as I stared at them. It wasn't the kind of illusion you attribute to tiredness. It was something different, something that made the skin on my neck crawl. Then it happened. A more defined figure appeared right in front of the car. My reaction was instinctive. I hit the brakes hard, causing the tires to squeal. The car stopped abruptly, and I felt my body being thrown forwards by the impact. There it was. It wasn't an animal or a person. The figure seemed to be made of mist itself, as if it had condensed into a humanoid form. It was tall, slender, but at the same time, there was something wrong with the proportion. Its arms were too long, its legs as thin as dry tree branches. A dim light emanated from the center of its body, like a flickering flame trapped in dirty glass. My mind struggled to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps it was the mist playing. With the headlights, I thought, an optical illusion caused by tiredness. But when the figure began to move, gliding along the road with an almost ceremonial slowness, any hope of logic evaporated. I tried to engage reverse, but my hands were shaking so badly that the gear didn't engage. The car creaked, protesting my lack of coordination. When I finally managed it, the figure was only a few meters away. She stopped, leaned forward slightly, as if studying me. And then I heard it. It wasn't just any sound, but a whisper, low and drawn out, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it carried a cadence that sounded almost ritualistic. Ritualistic. It was impossible not to listen, as if the voice was directly inside my head. The radio, which until then had been silent, exploded into a deafening static, cutting through the air like a knife. The figure didn't move, but the light inside it pulsed, growing stronger. It was as if it was reacting to my presence. Suddenly, it disappeared. Just as it appeared, it was swallowed up by the mist. But the relief that should have come with its absence was replaced by an even greater terror. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear. In fact, it seemed more intense, as if the entity was now all around me, lurking on all sides. I tried to move on. The road seemed endless, and the GPS no longer worked, the screen frozen at a point that made no sense. Every kilometer I traveled was an almost superhuman effort, with tension squeezing my chest like an invisible hand. Even though the figure hadn't reappeared, I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't just a frightening experience. It was something that seemed to have a purpose, an intention. I just didn't know what it was. When the pale light of the figure disappeared into the mist, my instinct was not one of relief, but of urgency. Something about that road seemed stuck in time, as if every meter I traveled took me further away from the world I knew. The tension grew, and at every turn I felt the presence of the figure, even without seeing it. It was like a ghost that didn't need to materialize to be felt. As I drove, I began to notice something strange. Abandoned objects by the side of the road. It wasn't unusual to find remains left by travelers, but this seemed different. An old clock with cracked glass was leaning against a rock. Further on, a worn suitcase, open, with clothes strewn about as if they had been dropped in a hurry. Each item seemed older than the last, like relics from different eras. Suddenly, I spotted a landmark by the side of the road. It was an old wooden sign, almost hidden by the vegetation. It seemed to indicate a nearby village. Blaran na Hitchhiker. The name sounded familiar, as if I'd heard it somewhere before, but I couldn't remember where. The mist seemed to condense around that area, like a silent warning not to proceed. Then my mind started making connections. Old stories from Assynt about unexplained disappearances in the region. Locals spoke of travelers who entered the road surrounded by mist and were never seen again. Some said it was just superstition, but there was something unsettling about the way the locals avoided these stories, as if the mere mention might attract something evil. The radio squawked again, interrupting my thoughts. This time, however, the static seemed interspersed with sounds, distant voices, a muffled cry, even what sounded like an old song. My skin crawled when I heard the melancholy rhythm, accompanied by a female voice that seemed to be crying as she sang. Almost in response, a light appeared in the distance. It wasn't as strong as the headlights of another vehicle, but weak and flickering, like the flame of an oil lamp. It swayed from side to side, approaching slowly. For a moment I thought it might be another car, or perhaps someone on foot, but when the light got closer, I realized it was nothing of the sort. The light was floating, with no visible source, moving erratically, but with an undeniable purpose. It seemed to be calling to me, guiding me off the main road and onto a dirt track that I hadn't even noticed before. My instincts screamed at me not to follow, but something about that light was hypnotic. It was as if it was invading my mind, pushing me to obey it. Heart pounding, I parked the car and switched off the engine. The idea of getting out of the car seemed absurd, but my hands moved as if they had a will of their own. When I stepped onto the cold, damp ground, the feeling of being watched intensified. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of my footsteps. I followed the light along the path, each step heavier than the last. The surrounding trees seemed to bend at impossible angles, forming arches that almost blocked out the sky. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath condensing in front of me. The sensation of being drawn into something ancient, something dangerous, was unmistakable. Finally, the light stopped. It hovered over a clearing where a ruined chapel was half hidden by the mist. The building looked so old that it was hard to tell if it was real or just an illusion created by the mist. As I approached, I heard something coming from inside, light footsteps, followed by an almost inaudible murmur. My body wanted to run away, but my legs kept moving forwards. I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep and primal, that crossing that threshold would change everything. But for some reason that I still didn't understand, I needed to know. Inside the chapel, the air seemed denser, laden with a metallic smell that mixed rust and damp earth. The walls were lined with ancient inscriptions, carved so deeply into the stone that they seemed to pulsate under the greenish light emanating from candles placed in niches. My heart was pounding, but there was no turning back. As I moved forward, I realized that the floor wasn't made of simple stones or beaten earth. It was a mosaic of objects, old coins, jewelry corroded by time, and even small straw dolls with charred features. Every step was an invasion, as if I were stepping into the forgotten history of dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. On the altar, an object caught my eye. It was an ancient-looking urn with reliefs of human figures in positions of supplication. The lid was ajar, allowing a thread of mist to escape, spreading through the room like a living smoke. As soon as my eyes settled on the urn, I felt a presence behind me. I turned round abruptly, expecting to find the figure that had followed me down the road. But what I saw was even more disturbing. Translucent shapes floating filled the space. They had no faces, just the indistinct outlines of humans trapped in a state between the physical world and something beyond. The voices began again, clearer this time, whispering in unison a phrase that sounded like an invitation or a warning. "Join us. Share the burden." Each word echoed in my mind, creating an unbearable weight in my chest. The mist became thicker, enveloping my feet and rising up to my knees as if trying to pull me in. I tried to move, but it was as if the ground had turned to mud. Desperate, I started muttering to myself, searching for any shred of sanity. Just then, a sound tore through the silence, the ringing of a distant bell. It reverberated off the chapel walls, causing the figures to recoil, almost as if they were afraid of something bigger. The light from the urn began to pulsate, growing in intensity until the brightness forced me to close my eyes. When I opened them again, everything was still. The chapel, the mist, the figures. Everything had disappeared, as if it had never been there. I was back on the road, next to my car, with the keys still in my trembling hands. However, something was different. The clock on the dashboard ticked at exactly the same time as when I had entered the chapel. It was as if time had stood still for the entire event, or perhaps I had never really left. Since that night, my life has changed irreversibly. Nightmares plague me, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even at the most mundane moments. The A837 road has become a dark landmark in my memory, a place I never intend to visit again. But you, who are watching this video, what would you do in my place? Would you keep going, or would you stop? Have you ever experienced something as inexplicable as this? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and activate the bell so you don't miss any more dark stories like this. Who knows, maybe the next story will be yours. Share it with anyone you think would have the courage to face something like this. Until the next video, if I'm still here to tell it.